In 1857, a man named Galen Clark was hiking alone near a small alpine lake in what would later become Yosemite National Park. At the time, this wasn't a tourist destination. There were no marked trails, no rangers, no infrastructure. Clark lived for long stretches in the wilderness, documenting plants, terrain, weather, and wildlife. He was practical, observant, and not known for superstition. Years later, in 1867, he would be appointed the park's first official guardian because of how deeply he knew the land. As Clark walked along the shoreline of the lake, commonly referred to as Gross Lake in later retellings, he heard a sound coming from the water. He stopped, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing moving. The sound continued anyway, a thin, high, wailing noise that he later described as resembling a lost puppy crying. It didn't echo like wind through leaves, and it didn't move the way an animal call normally would. It seemed fixed to the lake itself. Clark didn't report seeing anything unusual in the water. No ripples, no splashing, no wildlife, just the sound. He listened long enough to be unsettled by it, then continued on. What bothered him wasn't just the noise, it was that he couldn't place it. Clark was experienced enough to recognize the calls of animals common to the Sierra Nevada. This didn't match any of them. Later, Clark asked local Native Americans in the area if they knew of an animal that could make such a sound, or if anyone nearby kept dogs that might have wandered off. According to Clark's account, they told him it wasn't an animal. They said the sound was believed to come from the spirit of a young boy who had drowned in the lake years earlier. The boy's death was remembered as tragic, and the lake itself was treated as a place people did not enter. Clark recorded that he was warned not to go into the water. In some versions of what he was told, the spirit was believed to pull at or harm those who waded in. Clark didn't claim to witness anything like that himself, but he took the warning seriously enough to note it. What matters here is that this wasn't presented to him as a campfire story. It was delivered as a matter-of-fact explanation for why people avoided the lake. That avoidance makes sense even without a supernatural explanation. Alpine lakes in Yosemite are extremely cold year-round, often fed by snowmelt. Cold shock can incapacitate a person within seconds. The water can look calm and shallow while dropping off suddenly. Sound also behaves strangely in high elevation basins. Still water, temperature inversions, and surrounding rock can carry and distort noises in ways that feel unnatural, especially when you're alone. But Clark didn't try to rationalize the sound away in his notes. He didn't offer a theory. He simply recorded what he heard, what he was told, and where it happened. That's part of why the account still gets repeated. Clark documented hundreds of ordinary observations in Yosemite. This was one of the rare moments where he encountered something he couldn't explain and didn't attempt to smooth over. After that, Gross Lake quietly gained a reputation, not as a haunted attraction, but as a place people didn't linger. No dramatic warnings were posted, no legends were formalized. It was just one of those locations that locals treated differently, where you stayed on the trail, didn't swim, and didn't camp right on the shore. And this story survives because it sits in a pretty good middle ground. A credible observer, a specific location, a sound that didn't fit the environment, and a warning that lined up with real danger whether you believe in spirits or not. Clark didn't turn this experience into a ghost story, he left it unfinished. And in a place like Yosemite, where people still disappear, drown, or misjudge the landscape, that unfinished feeling tends to linger. Yosemite National Park is one of the most haunted national parks in America, not only from supernatural spirits, but from true stories, real stories of people going in and either not coming back or coming back a very different person. And today, I want to share some of Yosemite National Park's scariest stories and most horrifying things that go on. Let's get into this. Let's get into some more Yosemite National Park horrors. If you hang around weird internet rabbit holes long enough, you eventually run into Missing 411. That's the term used by author David Politis for a big collection of disappearances in national parks and wild areas that he thinks are too strange to be random. The basic pitch is people go missing in clusters, with odd details like sudden storms, no scent trails for dogs, bodies or clothes found in impossible spots, or no remains at all. And in his framing, the official explanations are either weak, incomplete, or suspiciously vague. A lot of his cases, though, turn out to be way less mysterious once you track down the actual newspaper articles, sheriff statements, or park reports. Some are clearly dementia, medical issues, bad terrain, or missing context that he just doesn't include. But there are a handful that still feel off, even after you strip away the hype. Nita Mayo is one of the cases that lands in that zone, one that still is unexplained. In August 2005, 64-year-old Nita Louise Mayo left Modesto in her champagne-colored 1997 Mercury Sable and drove east on Highway 108. Her destination was Donald Vista, a pull-off with a huge view over the canyon carved by the Middle Fork Stanislaus River. It's technically not inside Yosemite, but it's the same Sierra spine. Granite walls, big drops, and a whole lot of nothing if you step off the safe parts. It's right outside of Yosemite though, so it still counts. She was supposed to meet family later and never showed. That's when the alarm bells started. Searchers found her car parked at Donald Vista. The doors were unlocked. Inside were her purse, her ID, her credit cards, and her cell phone. All the stuff you'd take if you were leaving the area for real. It looked like she'd just stepped outside for a minute. One thing was missing: her camera. That detail is why this case keeps getting pulled into the 411 conversation. The most straightforward story is obvious. She parks, leaves her valuables in the car because she assumes she'll only be gone a few minutes, grabs the camera, and walks out to the overlook to take pictures. Donald Vista is not a gentle nature walk. It's a viewpoint on the edge of a very real drop. The first reasonable fear was that she got too close, slipped, and went over. So they went looking. Dog teams were brought in. Climbers went over the edge and worked the slopes below. Helicopters searched the canyon, scanning rock fields, brush, and river. If she'd fallen anywhere near that overlook, you'd expect something to show up. Clothing, a shoe, a piece of the camera, disturbed ground maybe, anything. But nothing. No body, no gear, no camera, no sign she ever went over the edge there at all. This is where the Missing 411 style of thinking kicks in for a lot of people. You've got an isolated location, a vehicle that feels frozen in time, and a person who steps out of frame and never enters it again. On this case in particular, Politis leans into that and basically says something very unusual and very dark happened to this woman, while dismissing things like abduction as too risky. But I don't know. If something criminal happened, it doesn't automatically have to be a serial killer or some elaborate conspiracy. A hit and run is one ugly but realistic possibility. She leaves the overlook to walk along the road, maybe to get a better angle or just stretch her legs. A driver clips her, and in a panic, they move the body to avoid charges. That would explain why the car looks untouched and why she isn't at the bottom of the canyon. The uncomfortable part is we don't actually know. There's no physical evidence of a fall, no proof of an abduction, no trace of her ever being dragged or attacked near the parking area. Just a car at a mountain overlook, personal stuff laid out like she'll be right back, a camera that left with her, and then a complete void. In early September 2021, 31-year-old Joel Curtis Thomason walked into Yosemite and never came back. He picked a route that doesn't show up on postcards. Not Yosemite Valley, not Glacier Point. He headed for Hetchy, the quieter side of the park, where the road dead ends at a concrete dam, and beyond that, it's all steep granite, deep water, and long miles of backcountry trail. Joel had a plan. He told family he was going to start from Hetch Hetchy, make his way toward Lake Eleanor, do some fishing, and to be back home by September 9th. On September 6th, he checked into the park like anyone else. At around 5 p.m. that day, a ranger saw him crossing above O'Shaughnessy Dam. That's the last confirmed time that anyone ever saw him alive. He wasn't walking in empty-handed. The descriptions later released by authorities are detailed enough to feel like a gear checklist. About 5'10", around 175 pounds, light hair, hazel eyes, wearing tan or blue zip-off hiking pants, a Garmin Tactics Delta solar GPS watch on his wrist. On his back, a large tan Kelty backpack. Strapped to it, a bright red inflatable kayak in a red pouch with a paddle to go with it. Packed inside and around that, a dark blue-green hammock, a bright green mummy sleeping bag, a yellow bear canister, a smaller red and black day pack, a metal US Army cup dated 1918, a black and yellow collapsible sink, a compact stove in a black bag, a Petzl Zipka headlamp, and fishing gear. In other words, he was geared up for exactly the kind of trip he described: hiking, camping, paddling, fishing. On the map, the route from Hetch Hetchy to Lake Eleanor doesn't look that extreme. 2 reservoirs, forest ridges in between. In person, that country is very different. The cliffs around Hetch Hetchy drop straight into deep water. The trails carve along steep slopes. A lot of the terrain is brushy, rocky, and hard to move through once you step off the established path. Cell service is basically non-existent. If something goes wrong out there, you're relying on your own gear and whoever knows your plans. Joel stepped onto the dam, crossed into that landscape, and vanished into it. When he didn't come back by September 9th, his family reported him missing. Yosemite launched a search. They knew his starting point. They knew his intended destination. They had a physical description and a long list of distinctive gear to watch for. Rangers and search teams worked that area looking for any sign of him or his equipment. Nothing turned up. No abandoned camp, no kayak, no scraps of clothing or broken gear, no trace along the obvious routes out. As of now, Joel Curtis Thomason is still listed as missing in Yosemite. In June of 2005, 51-year-old Michael Allen Fissery walked into one of the quietest corners of Yosemite and basically never existed again. He wasn't a newbie. Fissery was an experienced backpacker who knew the Sierra and knew the Hetch Hetchy side of the park. Mid-June, he sets out solo from the Hetch Hetchy trailhead with a wilderness permit. His rough plan was to head up along the north side of Hetch Hetchy Reservoir into the backcountry north of the water in the direction of Rancheria Falls, Tiltil Mountain, Tiltil Valley, maybe looping toward Lake Vernon and back out. It's the kind of route you pick when you want real wilderness. He's last seen on June 15th on the trail toward Tiltil Mountain. His permit is good until the 19th, so there's a built-in grace period where nobody's panicking yet. When he still isn't out by the 21st, his family contacts the park, and that's when things kick off. Yosemite launches what ends up being one of the biggest search operations they've ever done in that area. Ground teams, dog teams, helicopters, working the north side of Hetch Hetchy and the high country around Tiltil. They do find something. His backpack. It's off trail near Tiltil Mountain in a spot he hadn't specifically planned to be. The pack is on the forest floor like it was set down or dropped. This case is actually also a part of the missing 411 cases, and the weird detail from the missing 411 side is what's not there. His camera, his water bottle, and his topo map are missing from the bag. Whatever happened to him, he clearly left with the essentials you'd grab if you were going to scout or step away for a bit. From there, nothing. No clothing, no bones, no boot, no scraps of gear, no camera, no map, no water bottle. Dogs can't pick up a useful trail from the pack, which could just be time working against them. By the time they get to the exact spot, the bag might have been sitting there for days. There was also snow in that area around the time he went missing, which is enough to erase tracks and hide a body in broken granite and underbrush. Once scavengers and weather get involved, an entire person can disappear shockingly fast. What's left is this really nasty kind of silence. You've got a fit, experienced backpacker in a mapped, permitted area in a park that threw a ton of resources at finding him, and the only physical trace is one backpack lying in the dirt. In June 1987, 16-year-old Teresa Ann Beer was living in Fresno, California, in what everyone later described as a rough home life, staying with her uncle, his kids, and his teenage girlfriend. She was behind in school, described as a slow learner with a very young-sounding voice, more like an 8 or 9-year-old than a high schooler. That made her vulnerable in ways nobody around her really seemed to protect her from. One of the adults orbiting that house was Russell Skip Welch, a 43-year-old friend of her uncle. Welch was obsessed with Bigfoot. He told people he studied Sasquatch, believed there were communes of them in the Sierra Nevada, and talked like he knew those mountains better than anyone. To a teenager in a bad situation who loved the idea of something weird and exciting, that probably sounded like an escape. On the morning of June 1st, 1987, Welch showed up at the house with what sounded like a normal offer. He'd drive Teresa to school. Instead, she never made it to class. Multiple people later told police they saw Teresa with Welch around Fresno that day. She told at least one person they were going up into the mountains to look for Bigfoot, and she seemed genuinely excited about it. By that night, she still hadn't come home. Her uncle reported her missing. At that point, nobody even knew where to start. Authorities didn't know if she'd simply run off, if she was with friends, or if something else had happened between Fresno and the Sierra. Over the next few days, deputies north of Fresno got their first hard clue. In Madera County, near the tiny community of North Fork, they spotted Welch's tan brown Monte Carlo abandoned off a remote forest road. Instead of staking it out, they left the car and came back later, and when they did, it was gone. That mistake cost them their best early chance to grab him and maybe find Teresa. 10 days later, after Teresa disappeared, police finally tracked Welch down at his mother's house in Fresno. That's when he unloaded the story that would turn the case from a typical teen missing investigation into something that sounds unreal. He said Bigfoot took her. Welch told detectives that he and Teresa had driven up into the high country near Shut-Eye Park, a granite summit in the Sierra National Forest, just barely south of Yosemite's boundary. That area is classic Sierra Nevada backcountry. High elevation, around 8,000 feet, and everything else we've already been talking about this video, like big slabs of granite, patches of forest, etc. According to Welch, he and Teresa set up a camp near Shut-Eye. He claimed they saw Sasquatches in the area, that there was some kind of tribe of Bigfoot moving around them, and that at some point Teresa was taken by these creatures where he was powerless to do anything. In another version he gave, he said they argued, became separated, and then she vanished into the night. Either way, the main story never changed. If you believed Welch, a monster carried her off. Investigators obviously didn't buy that, but they still needed facts, not just how ridiculous his story sounded. Welch agreed to lead them back to the exact campsite he said he'd shared with Teresa near Shut-Eye Park. When they got there, they actually found proof she had been in that spot. Searchers recovered Teresa's purse and several pieces of her clothing at the campsite, items confirmed to have belonged to her. There was no sign of her physically, no body, no obvious blood or struggle that they could see, but it killed any idea that she'd never gone to the mountains in the first place. She had been there. She had been alone with a 43-year-old man who was obsessed with Bigfoot, and now she was gone. From there, the search turned into a full-scale ground operation. Rangers, deputies, and search and rescue volunteers combed the Shut-Eye Peak area on foot. They brought in bloodhounds. They searched ravines, drainages, rock fields, and the dense forest around the peak, looking for any trace, clothing, bones, jewelry, anything. Nothing turned up. Not a shoe, not a scrap of fabric beyond what they'd already found at the campsite. Meanwhile, the legal side moved fast. Fresno authorities charged Welch with child abduction because at minimum, at the very least, he'd taken a 16-year-old girl into the mountains without legal permission when he was supposed to be driving her to school. The state had witnesses who saw them together, they had the campsite that he'd led them to, and they had the bizarre Bigfoot story he'd already told police. On paper, that sounds like an easy conviction, but the DA hit a nasty problem that made this case feel even uglier. If they tried Welch only for abduction and later found Teresa's body, double jeopardy rules could block them from charging him with murder tied to the same incident. Prosecutors were convinced he knew more than he was saying. Detectives openly told reporters they believed Welch was responsible, but they couldn't prove what he'd actually done, where she was, or if she was dead. So they made a choice that still pisses people off decades later. They dropped the abduction case to keep the door open for a future homicide charge if Teresa was ever found. But no body ever turned up. No physical evidence beyond what was at that camp. No confession. Russell Skip Welch walked out of the legal system and lived the rest of his life a free man. He reportedly died in the late 1990s. Teresa has never been found and is still listed as a missing person with the state of California. That's the part that makes this feel like a horror story and not just a cold case. You've got a vulnerable 16-year-old girl in an abusive home latching on to the idea of an adventure in the mountains with an older man who talks about monsters in the woods. You've got the geography, that shut-eye peak high country just outside Yosemite, all white granite and dark timber and steep drop-offs where screams don't carry very far. You've got a predator who hides behind a folklore claiming a tribe of Bigfoot took her instead of owning what he did. And then you've got the system, deputies who let his car slip away, a legal strategy that kept him out of prison entirely, and a wilderness big enough to swallow every trace of a teenage girl. In April 2005, 86-year-old Doug Pierce left behind one of the eeriest calling cards in the whole Yosemite region, a burned-out truck on a remote mountain road and no trace of the man who'd been driving it. Doug lived in Modesto and was the kind of older guy who stayed active and involved in his community. He volunteered regularly at local schools, Woodland Elementary and Mariposa Middle School, and that's actually how people realized something was wrong. He was last seen in Modesto on April 21st, 2005. He was scheduled to volunteer the following day. He never showed up to either school. A few days after that, searchers found his pickup, a 1990s Ford Ranger, stuck in the mud and burned up on a rough mountain track, Chaya Mountain Road above Ponderosa Basin, near Summit Camp in Mariposa County. It's the kind of place you end up when you're wandering in the foothills below Yosemite, forested, steep in spots, quiet enough that you can park there for days without anyone noticing. The scene was disturbing, but according to the limited write-ups that exist, it didn't scream crime scene. Investigators said it appeared the truck had caught fire accidentally, maybe from the engine, maybe something electrical, while Doug was trying to get it unstuck. There was no body in or near the vehicle, no obvious sign of a struggle, just mud, scorch marks, and emptiness. From there, the working theory was brutally simple. Once the truck was no longer drivable, Doug tried to walk out of the mountains on foot, got disoriented in the maze of logging roads and ridges, and never made it back to civilization. It's pretty sad. He was 86 years old in steep country with thin air, predators, and no cell service. If he'd collapsed in dense brush or tumbled into a ravine, scavengers in time could easily erase most evidence before anyone ever got close. 1 minute, you're an older man in a familiar truck, heading toward the edge of park country. The next, all anyone ever sees again is a Ford Ranger burned out in the mud, on a nameless bend of mountain road, and a missing persons file with almost nothing in it. When it comes to Yosemite Park, people love to talk about portals, missing 411 clusters, gateways, and the granite. But in the late 90s, one of the worst things that ever happened around Yosemite had nothing to do with the wilderness being mysterious. It was a guy with a room key. That guy was Cary Stayner. He grew up in Merced, about 2 hours from Yosemite, and on paper, his family already had one of the most famous crime stories in California history. Cary was born in 1961, the oldest son. When he was 11, his 7-year-old little brother, Stephen Stainer, was abducted on the way home from school by a convicted child molester, Kenneth Parnell. Stephen was held captive for more than 7 years and eventually escaped in 1980 with another kidnapped boy, Timmy White. That rescue turns into a whole media circus. TV interviews, a book deal, and eventually the NBC miniseries, I Know My First Name is Stephen. Cary is somewhere in the background of all that. In one interview recording, he later admits that when Stephen came home, they didn't really get along. Stephen suddenly getting gifts, clothes, attention, while Cary is just the quiet older brother in a baseball cap on the edge of the frame. Reporters who went back and watched those clips point out that everyone smiling around Stephen and Cary is just not. He looks at his brother, looks away, walks off. A decade later, the family gets hit again. In 1989, Stephen dies in a motorcycle accident at 24. In 1990, the brother's uncle, Jesse Jerry Stainer, is murdered, shot with his own shotgun in what's officially described as a burglary. Cary is the one who finds the body. By the mid-90s, people around Cary are starting to notice that he's not okay. A childhood friend remembers him talking about wanting to drive a truck through his workplace and kill everyone inside, then burn the place down. The friend tells him to get help. Instead, Cary drifts. He gets picked up on a minor drug charge in 1997, spends a few days in county, gets released. At some point after that, he lands a job as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge, a roadside motel in El Portal, right at the western gateway to Yosemite National Park. That's the setting. One of the most famous national parks in the world, a mid-range family motel on the access road, and a quiet, slightly awkward maintenance guy who knows every room layout, every spare key, every blind spot in the building. The victims for this next part of the story are Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and 16-year-old Silvina Poloso, an exchange student from Argentina who was staying with the Sund family. Carol and her husband Jens lived in the Stockton area, ran a real estate business, and had adopted 3 younger kids as well. This Yosemite trip was supposed to be a little special treat for the older girls, a few days in the park before Julie started high school in earnest, and before Silvina went home. On Friday, February 12th, 1999, Carol, Julie, and Silvina flew from the Bay Area, picked up a red Pontiac Grand Prix rental, and headed east into the Sierra Nevada foothills. They checked into the Cedar Lodge, which marketed itself as a Yosemite base specifically. Cheaper than staying inside the park, but close enough that you could drive into the valley in under an hour. They spent the weekend doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. On Monday the 15th, they hiked an established trail in Yosemite, came back to the motel, ate at the Cedar Lodge restaurant, and literally even rented a VHS copy of Jerry Maguire from the front desk to watch in their room. And that was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. What they were supposed to do was pretty simple. After Yosemite, they'd head back to San Francisco, meet up with Jens, and then continue on with the trip. But Jens is waiting in the city on February 16th, and they just never show up. No phone call, no checkout, no returned rental car. He calls police. The rental company confirms nobody extended the contract, and suddenly what was supposed to be a safe, over-planned mom trip is a missing persons case in one of the roughest landscapes in California. At first, investigators do the obvious thing. They assume some kind of accident. Yosemite is cliffs, rivers, ice, switchbacks. Rangers and deputies start searching the usual routes, the turnouts, the drop-offs. Cedar Lodge staff tell officers the room doesn't look like a crime scene. No overturned furniture, no obvious blood, no signs of a fight. Behind the scenes, though, the scale of the response ramps up fast. You've got local sheriff offices, the California California Highway Patrol, and then FBI comes in and builds a task force. They do ground searches, ski teams, helicopters, door-to-door interviews with lodge employees and long-term locals. Still nothing. FBI agent Nick Rossi tells the press they haven't found enough to say if this is a tragic hiking accident or a criminal act. 4 days after the women disappear, February 19th, a random passerby finds Carol Soon's wallet lying intact on the side of the highway in Modesto, hours away from Yosemite. That one detail blows up the lost in the park theory. If the wallet is sitting on the shoulder of a Central Valley road, someone drove it out of the mountains and tossed it, which means someone is moving around with their belongings and making choices. Meanwhile, Cedar Lodge becomes the center of the universe. Cops start working down a list. Every guest, every cleaner, every restaurant worker, every handyman. They interview Cary Stayner along with everyone else. At that point, he's just the skinny maintenance guy who unclogs toilets and fixes heaters. He doesn't ping anyone's radar, and he has no serious criminal record to trip the background checks. The task force is leaning toward a theory that the danger is outside the park. Somebody who grabbed them on the road, not a guy with a master key. Almost 5 weeks go by without an answer. Then, on March 18th to 19th, 1999, and it's both because you'll see both dates in coverage depending on when it hit print. Searchers in Tuolumne County find a burned out red Pontiac Grand Prix down a rough spur road in the woods near Long Barn off Highway 108. It's the Soon's rental car. The car has been driven off the main road down a trashy logging spur locals use to dump old appliances and junk. The trunk is welded shut with fire damage. When they pry it open, there are 2 bodies inside, burned beyond recognition. Dental records, though, later confirm they're Carol Soon and Sylvana Peloso. Both had been killed before the fire, reporting at the time that they were likely strangled or had their throats cut, then put in the trunk and the car was set ablaze. But Julie is nowhere. Now it's officially a murder investigation. The media moves from missing Yosemite tourists to Yosemite murders. Families who already feel sick now know exactly what they're dealing with. And for the people who live in those little mountain towns and work in the park, this is nightmare fuel. Someone used their backyard as a dumping ground, knew the back roads well enough to hide a car for a month, and then vanished again. Investigators start saying the obvious. Whoever did this is probably local or intimately familiar with the terrain. That burned out car is not somewhere a random tourist from the flatlands is going to find by accident. They also start playing with the idea that it might have been more than one person. The level of control required to take 3 people in a public tourist setting, move them, kill them, and get the car to that spot starts to sound like a crew, not a lone offender. And locals echo that. They tell reporters that they can't imagine one person pulling this off. But what nobody's looking at seriously yet is the guy quietly fixing faucets back at the Cedar Lodge. Just when the task force thinks they've seen the worst of it, there's one more twist. On March 25th, 1999, authorities receive an envelope with an anonymous hand-drawn map. The map marks a spot near Lake Don Pedro, south of where the car was found. Scribbled on it is a line that reads, "We had fun with this one." Searchers follow the directions and find another body partially hidden among the brush off a logging road. 15-year-old Julie Soon. She's been killed separately from the others. Evidence later shows she was sexually assaulted and strangled, her body dumped in a different location. Whoever sent that map clearly wanted credit but also wanted to stay invisible. It's taunting, specific, and weirdly confident. The line, "We had fun with this one," pushes everybody further toward the idea of a group of offenders. The reward money gets bumped. The press conferences get darker. The FBI builds profiles and leans harder into the idea of a small, violent crew working out of Central Valley, preying on tourists. By late spring, they believe they have their people. The task force focuses on a cluster of Modesto area meth dealers and ex-cons who have violent records and vague ties to the region. 4 men are hauled before a federal grand jury in April. The FBI is publicly cautious, but privately pretty sure they're circling the right pond. While all of that is happening, press conferences, composite sketches, meth ring theories, Cary Stayner is still at Cedar Lodge, fixing air conditioners. watching search helicopters buzz the valley, listening to tourists talk about the murders that happened right down the hall from where he works. He's already killed 3 people at this point, and nobody has the slightest idea. By the time summer rolled around, Yosemite was already sitting under this weird, anxious cloud. 3 women had vanished from a motel right outside the park and then turned up murdered, and everyone had been told, "Don't worry, we've got the guys." Joey Ruth Armstrong was the opposite of what you picture when you hear serial killer victim. She wasn't a tourist who'd wandered into danger, she lived there. She was 26, a naturalist and environmental educator who taught kids about wildflowers and bear safety. The kind of person who actually loved the park and planned her life around it. That July, she was staying alone in a little cabin in Foresta, a tiny community tucked inside the park boundary. On July 21st, 1999, she was packing to leave for a backpacking trip to meet friends. When she didn't show up, the people waiting for her got worried fast. They called around, couldn't reach her, and eventually someone went to the cabin to check. What they walked into didn't look like a missed alarm or someone who just left early. The yard and porch showed signs of a struggle. Her car and gear were still there. Rangers joined in and started combing the area. Not far from the cabin, near a wooded stream about half a mile away, searchers found her body. A few feet away in the water, they found her severed head. It was brutal, personal, and so out of step with the lost hiker stories everyone usually associates with Yosemite that there is no way to pretend this was just another wilderness accident. Somebody had hunted her. The one thing investigators did have was a car. Neighbors had seen a blue International Scout parked awkwardly near Joey's cabin around the time she disappeared. Rangers recognized it. It belonged to one of the familiar faces who drifted around the area. You'll never guess. A quiet Cedar Lodge handyman named Cary Stainer. When they ran it down, they realized he'd already been on their radar after the earlier hotel murders, but he'd been dismissed back then as the helpful maintenance guy who opened rooms for agents and looked normal enough. Now his truck was parked outside the one cabin in the forest where a woman ended up decapitated. That bumped him from background extra to center of the board overnight. Even then, the system almost let him slip again. Local officers actually detained Stainer on July 21st on a minor marijuana charge and questioned him about Joey, but a clerical screw-up meant he was released and walked right back out the door. When he got back to Cedar Lodge, he started quietly liquidating his life. Trying to sell his car, dumping his stuff, then vanishing. Within days, a bulletin went out with his name and that blue Scout, warning that he was wanted in connection with Armstrong's murder. He didn't go far. He ended up at Laguna del Sol, a nudist resort near Sacramento, living in a tent, drinking at the bar, and chatting up strangers while his face was on the news. That's where the FBI finally grabbed him. A woman at the resort recognized him from the "Be on the Lookout" notice, called it in, and agents Jeff Reinick and John Bowles drove out. Staff told them he'd be easy to spot because he was the only one wearing clothes. They found him sitting alone in a corner booth. No chase, no shootout, no dramatic escape attempt. He agreed to go with them for questioning. On the drive back to the field office, Reinick started talking with him about his brother Steven, about how Steven's kidnapper got a laughably small sentence compared to what he'd done. Stainer got emotional. That car ride was basically the first time in his life somebody in authority treated him like a person instead of just Steven's brother, and he latched onto it, at least from his interviews. That's what we can deduce. Once they were in that interview room, the mask came off. At first, he tried to bargain, asking for things that made it clear where his head actually was. He wanted access to child sexual material in exchange for the truth, which the agents obviously shut down. Oh my god. But the connection Reinick had built on the drive worked. Stainer started talking. He admitted that he'd killed Joey, and then, almost like he'd been waiting for someone to give him permission, he added, "And there's more." Over hours of calm, clinical confession, he walked them through 4 murders in total: Joey Armstrong and the 3 Cedar Lodge tourists from earlier that year. He described walking up to Joey's cabin with a backpack and a .22 revolver hidden inside. She stepped onto the porch to talk to him. When she turned away, he put the gun to her head. She fought like hell. He bound her with duct tape, forced her into his vehicle, and at one point she even threw herself out of the moving car and tried to run. He chased her down, dragged her into the woods, and killed her, then mutilated the body to stage the scene the way he wanted. The way agents describe it, she comes across as the one person in this story who refused to go quietly. He comes across as what he was, a coward who needed a gun, tape, and surprise to feel powerful. Then he rewound back to February. Months earlier, we already talked about how Carol Soond, her daughter Julie, and their family friend vanished from Cedar Lodge, and how their buried rental car eventually turned up with 2 bodies in the trunk and a map mailed to the FBI leading to Julie's remains. Stainer filled in the parts that nobody knew. He admitted he used his access as a handyman and a master key to get into their rooms at night, held them at gunpoint, and spent hours inside that motel turning it into his own little sealed-off horror story, before driving Carol's car into the hills, killing them one by one, and dumping the bodies. The letter that taunted investigators, "We had fun with this one," came from him. The random meth suspects they'd been parading in front of the cameras were nothing but a dead end. Legally, the system split him in half. The Joey Armstrong case was handled in federal court because it happened inside the national park. The Cedar Lodge murders went to state court. He pled guilty to Joey's murder first and got life without parole. In the state case, he tried the insanity angle and his lawyers leaned hard on his childhood. The years of living in the shadow of Stephen's kidnapping, the abuse he'd described in the family home, the tumor doctors once found on his brain, the obsessive sexual fantasies he said had been spiraling since adolescence. Prosecutors pushed back with how he'd actually behaved. Stalking, planning, cutting phone lines, bringing a prepared kit to attack strangers, cleaning scenes, lying smoothly for months while he kept working around tourists. In 2002, a California jury convicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder and found the special circumstances for the death penalty. That December, he was sentenced to death and shipped off to San Quentin's death row. And from everything I could find online, he is still awaiting death in that same place today. For Yosemite, the damage was already done before any verdict. This wasn't any kind of wildness fluke. A park that sells itself as this wholesome, almost sacred place had turned into a hunting ground for someone who lived inside its orbit, used its isolated cabins and remote roads as tools, and hid in plain sight while national agencies chased the wrong men. Families still go there and take the same photos at the same overlooks, but baked into the landscape now is the knowledge that, for a stretch of 1999, a guy who grew up in the shadow of one kidnapping turned one of America's favorite parks into his own private crime scene. In early October 2008, a 42-year-old backpacker named Christopher Andrews sent out a distress signal from the high Granite County just north of Yosemite. By the time rescuers finally reached him, he was already dead. Christopher was out in the Immigrant Wilderness, a stretch of country that sits right up against Yosemite's northern boundary. Think big slabs of granite, cold lakes, and long distances between people. He was somewhere between Relief Reservoir, around 7,200 feet, and Iceland Lake, around 9,200 feet. It's classic Sierra terrain, open exposed rock, not a lot of trees to hide under if the weather turns. On October 3rd, 2008, he hit the panic button on his emergency transponder. That alone is already rare. This is another missing 411 case, and a lot of missing 411 cases focus on people who don't have beacons, who just vanish with no signal at all. Christopher did the opposite. He called for help. The problem was timing. When his transponder went off, a storm was rolling through. High winds and bad conditions made it too dangerous for helicopters to get into that steep granite basin. Ground teams started pushing toward the coordinates, but in that kind of rock country, even only a few miles away can mean hours of brutal scrambling. When the weather finally broke and a helicopter was able to fly the area, searchers spotted something that looked like the outline of a body trapped in a granite crevice on a steep slope. When they got close enough to confirm, it was Christopher. A sheriff's deputy later said he may have taken a slip. No talk of a monster, no talk of impossible distances, just the kind of fall that happens when you mix wet rock, high angle terrain, and bad weather. This is where the missing 411 treatment kicks in. The embellished version tries to make it sound like he climbed some random granite spire in a storm for no reason, fell off the top, and landed in that crevice. The actual reporting doesn't say that though. It just says what was visible: steep granite, a crevice, a body, and a man who clearly had enough time after the initial accident to activate his transponder. Realistically, the most likely chain of events is ugly but straightforward. First, he slips on slick granite or misjudges his footing. Then he falls or slides into a narrow chute or crack he can't easily climb out of. Then, injured and possibly hypothermic, he realizes he's in serious trouble. And then finally, he turns on his beacon and waits for help that can't reach him fast enough because of the storm. And the horror here isn't that it's unexplainable. It's that even when you do everything right, an experienced backpacker in a known area carrying an emergency beacon, you can still meet your end in a spot where granite, weather, and timing make rescue impossible. In July of 1943, in the middle of World War II, a well-off California businessman walked into Yosemite with a group of friends and then just never made it to camp. His name was Emerson Holt. He was in his mid-50s, vice president of the Riverside Title Company, and a regular in Yosemite. This wasn't some first-time tourist blundering into the wilderness. On July 18th, 1943, he joined a hiking party leaving Happy Isles in Yosemite Valley, headed up the Merced River toward Merced Lake Camp, about 7 miles away on one of the park's classic corridor trails. For most of the day, nothing was weird. The group followed the main route up the canyon. This is not some obscure off-trail scramble. It's a well-traveled path along the river. Near the end of the hike, when they were almost to Merced Lake, Holt reportedly started having pain in his legs and decided to stop and rest. He told his friends to go on ahead and said he'd catch up once he felt better. They left him sitting beside the trail in fairly tame terrain and kept going toward camp. He never arrived. When an hour passed with no sign of him, the group got worried fast. They backtracked down the trail to where they'd left him resting. No Emerson, no sweater, no pack, no obvious fall site, just empty trail. At that point, they reported him missing and park staff launched a search right away. What makes this one stick out, even to rangers at the time, is where he vanished. The spot between the Merced River and the surrounding canyon walls is a narrow corridor. You've got the river, shallow and slow in that section, and then steep granite slopes on either side, not sheer cliffs right at the trail. There were no deep pools, no big drop-offs, and no raging white water immediately nearby, according to Park Superintendent Frank Kindred, who described the disappearance as mystifying in contemporary coverage. Searchers combed the area along the trail, the river banks, and the surrounding slopes. They checked the shallow Merced for any sign that he'd slipped in and drowned. Nothing. No body, no gear, no scrap of clothing. Newspapers at the time reported that a large search party kept at it for days, and follow-up mentions months later still referred to Holt as missing with no resolution. The National Park Service's cold case list still has him. Holt Emerson, 7/18/1943. Last known point, Merced Lake. The most mundane explanation is the one local historians lead toward even back then, that Holt somehow ended up in the river and drowned, his body never recovered. The California Historical Society's quarterly wrote shortly after that he disappeared late in July while on a walking trip from Yosemite Valley to Merced Lake, and that it was supposed he'd been drowned in the river, though they admitted his body had never been found. But even if that's what happened, the details are awkward. He was last seen in an area where the water was shallow and not especially fast. He was already complaining about leg pain, which makes him less likely to suddenly strike off up steep rock or bushwhack into crazy terrain. And this wasn't some remote trackless corner corner of the park, it was a major route with a lot of foot traffic even in the 1940s. You'd expect something, a hat, a sweater, a body downstream, if he'd simply slipped and been carried off. Because of that combination, experienced hiker, friends nearby, easy terrain, massive search, and absolutely no trace, Holt's case is one of the older stories people point to when they talk about the Yosemite cluster in the whole missing 411 conversation. Disappearances in and around the park that feel just a little too clean, a little too empty for the usual got lost and succumbed to the elements explanation. Officially, Emerson Holt is still missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, he's one of those ghosts that hangs over Yosemite's hiking culture. A man who sat down less than a mile from camp, told his friends he'd see them in a bit, and then never set foot on a trail again. James Arthur was 67 in July 2008, a retired Air National Guard lieutenant colonel from Fresno. Friends and colleagues described him as an experienced camper and a hiker, the kind of guy who'd spend decades outdoors and wasn't easily rattled in the mountains. On Monday, July 28th, he left home for what should have been a straightforward solo day trip. Drive up into the Sierra National Forest north of Base Lake, hike and take photos around the Star Lakes/Iron Lakes area, and be back before dark. He told family where he was going and when he'd return. He brought a camera, a walking cane, and basic day hike gear. James did have some health issues: diabetes controlled by diet, high blood pressure, and occasional dizzy spells. Search and rescue notes from later mention all of that explicitly. So he wasn't a 20-year-old trail runner, but he was still in decent shape and very used to this terrain. But he never came home that night. When he didn't show up as planned on July 28th, his family reported him missing. Initial efforts focused on the Star Lakes area, where he said he was going, but there was no sign of him. The next day, July 29th, searchers found his dark blue Dodge Ram pickup not at Star Lakes, but farther north on Beasaur Road, near the rough four-wheel drive track that climbs toward Iron Lakes. The truck was stuck in mud or soft ground, doors closed, no obvious damage, and authorities said there were no indications of foul play at the vehicle itself. That shifted the whole search area. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Arthur's description on the Iron Lakes Road, about half a mile uphill from his truck. This becomes his official last known position. From there, nobody knows which way he went. The search that followed was big. The Madera County Sheriff's Office and mutual aid SAR teams treated his truck as a staging point. Teams were driven in on rough forest roads, then sent out on foot from around 8,000 feet of elevation, sweeping ridges and drainages around the last known spot. The China Lake Mountain Rescue Group's internal report talks about hours-long line searches through steep, brushy terrain. Teams spaced just close enough to keep each other in sight, covering multiple adjacent zones in a grid. They worked both south of his last known location and then up on the high ridges north and west of it. To the north, the terrain drops off in a series of 150 to 200 foot cliffs. Exactly the kind of country where a single misstep can send you somewhere no one on a normal trail will ever see. Those cliff bands became part of the search boundary. Over several days, additional teams arrived. More SAR units, dog teams, and a full command post with Forest Service and state resources. One assignment had a 7-person line combing down an entire drainage from near the vehicle, about 1,200 vertical feet, then back up the opposite side. Again, nothing but old boot prints from other searchers. Dogs worked multiple sectors around the truck and drainages. There were no verified cane marks, no camera, no clothing, no body. The only clue anyone ever mentions is that his camera was missing from his truck, which suggests he did leave the vehicle and head out on foot, probably intending to shoot photos. But there's no evidence of where he went after that half-mile stretch of four-wheel drive road. And this is where the missing 411 crowd comes in. Cases like James Arthur, experienced outdoorsman, clear destination, found vehicle, zero physical trace despite a major search, are exactly the kind of thing that they flag as cluster material. His disappearance is often grouped with other strange vanishings in the broader Yosemite High Sierra region, even though this spot is technically in Sierra National Forest rather than inside Yosemite's official boundary. If you zoom out and strip away the paranormal theories, there are some mundane explanations on the table. His known health issues mean a sudden medical event, dizzy spell, heart problem, blood sugar crash, is very plausible. In this terrain, if that happens near cliffs, talus, or dense underbrush, it doesn't take much to end up in a chute, crack, or deadfall where even helicopters and line searches won't ever see you. The area around Iron Lakes is a maze of granite slabs, tree wells, and steep drainages. Scavenging animals in a long Sierra winter can erase a lot of evidence. But the hard fact is, nobody has ever found his camera, his body, or any of his equipment. The search area was roughly 16 square miles of rugged country, combed repeatedly by professionals and volunteers, and it produced nothing tied to him. In August of 1963, 4-year-old Donald Griffin was camping with his family at Huntington Lake in the Sierra National Forest, up around 7,000 feet in the same kind of high Sierra terrain that surrounds Yosemite. It's early morning, his parents are getting breakfast ready, and Donald does what a lot of little kids do when they get curious. He wanders off. His mom later tells reporters that he left the campground before breakfast to go look for a coyote he thought he heard barking. It wasn't a coyote at all, just a German shepherd somewhere nearby, but that gives you a pretty good snapshot of where his head was at. 4 years old, following an animal sound with zero sense of how quickly you can get yourself lost in the mountains. When his parents realize he's missing and a quick search around camp doesn't turn him up, they call for help. The response is big for the time. Around 200 people show up to help look for him. You've got deputies, Forest Service personnel, volunteers, people on foot combing the slopes and trails around Huntington Lake. The terrain there is nasty in the way that looks scenic from a distance but horrible up close. Like, I keep repeating this, but pockets of trees and boulders where you could be 10 yards away from someone and never see them. It's so hard to find people. On top of that, the lake sits high enough that nights are cold even in August. As the search drags into multiple days, temperatures are dropping into the low 30s at night. For an adult with gear, that's uncomfortable. For a 4-year-old with whatever he left camp in, that's lethal. For days, they find nothing. No clear trail, no clothing, no body, just empty terrain and a clock that is obviously running out. Then, on about the 4th day, a search team near Potter Pass finally hits the one clue that leads them to him. Potter Pass is a high saddle above Huntington Lake, so it's not just somewhere else, it's significantly uphill, around 10,000 feet. Searchers spot tiny bare footprints leading along the route toward the pass, and when they follow those tracks, they eventually find Donald's body lying face up over a large fallen pine. He's roughly 5 miles from where he started and a couple thousand feet higher in elevation. The coroner's conclusion, although being pretty simple and brutal, was just that after days of wandering, cold nights and no food and no water, he basically laid down, went to sleep, and never woke up. Exposure, exhaustion, and hunger all stacked on top of a little kid's body that just couldn't keep going. A couple of details are what people latch onto when they talk about how unsettling this one is. First, searchers had already been through that general area in earlier sweeps. Some of them openly said they'd walked that trail on previous days and hadn't seen him there. At the same time, they admitted the terrain was so steep, brushy, and broken up that you could easily pass right by a small child tucked against a log or hidden by rocks and branches. Second, there's the why uphill problem. From an adult survival mindset, you'd expect someone lost and cold to stay low, look for shelter, water, or human activity. But in a lot of child lost cases, especially with very young kids, they do the opposite. They head higher, trying to get a better view, or they just keep following whatever path their brain latches onto with no concept of distance or weather. And I guess that lines up with what we see here. A 4-year-old chasing a sound, then just continuing to move through the landscape until his body gives out. In July of 1957, 2-year-old David Allen Scott vanished from what should have been one of the safest places in the world for a toddler, a crowded family campground. His family had taken him and his older siblings to Annette's Mono Village on the western shore of Twin Lakes, in the High Sierra east of Yosemite. It's a little resort valley hemmed in on 3 sides by brutal, steep granite slopes that shoot up from about 7,200 feet to 9,000 to 10,000 feet, with the lake closing off the 4th side. At some point on July 13th, David was playing with a small group of kids near the campsite when he just wasn't there anymore. In that tiny window where nobody had eyes directly on him, he slipped out of sight into terrain where, realistically, there were only a few places he could go, and somehow managed to choose the worst one. The response, again here, was huge for the time. Over the next couple of days, more than 250 people turned out to search, including Marines, local deputies, and dog teams. They grid searched the valley floor, the edges of the lake, the brush near camp, everywhere a 2-year-old should logically be. Nothing. The search was so thorough that by the 3rd day, law enforcement and David's parents started to fear the only explanation left was a kidnapping. They actually put out bulletins assuming someone had taken him out of the area by car, because the idea that a toddler had climbed out of that bowl of a valley on his own felt impossible. That's why what happened next hit everyone so hard. A Marine searcher found one of David's little canvas shoes way above Mono Village on the slope of Eagle Peak, around 8,000 to 10,000 feet up depending on which report you read. However you slice it though, that's a near vertical climb of well over 1,000 feet for a 40-pound 2-year-old. From that point on, the whole search flipped direction. Dog teams and ground crews pushed upslope from the shoe, following scent and working through loose boulders and steep talus. Eventually, they found David's body on the mountainside, lying near a big rock in a boulder field overlooking the valley. Early retellings like to say that he was basically naked except for a shirt and a sock. The contemporary reporting is a little less dramatic, but still strange. He was almost fully clothed, just missing his pants and that one shoe, with the shoe reportedly not far from where he was lying. His pants were never recovered, which is probably as simple as brown fabric and brown rock and dirt, but it adds to the uneasy feeling that nothing about this scene lines up correctly. The coroner ruled his death exposure, a combination of cold, exhaustion, and probably dehydration. And that makes sense when you remember that this wasn't the valley floor with mild summer weather. I mean, that's what people were talking about in the first days of the search. But up around 9,000 to 10,000 feet in the Sierra, even in July, nights can drop close to freezing, and a tiny kid who's been climbing until he physically can't anymore is not going to last long. The weirdest detail, and the one that still sticks with people, is how far he got and how he looked when they found him. In one local paper, searchers said his skin was almost black from sun exposure after just a few days on the open rock. On top of that, no one can really explain why he went up like that. This is one of those early high country cases that people fold into the wider missing 411 Yosemite cluster because it hits so many of the same beats we see later. A very young child vanishing in seconds near water, an enormous search that turns up nothing in the obvious zones, and then a body suddenly found way above where anyone thinks they should be. It didn't technically happen inside Yosemite's park boundary, but it is in the same Sierra Nevada corridor, and it's one of the cases that set the tone for how unsettling these mountains can be when a simple day of camping goes sideways. By this point in the video, you already know Yosemite is basically a giant granite amphitheater for weirdness. Hundreds of thousands of acres of cliffs, deep forest, and empty back roads where you can disappear without anyone seeing you leave. But the horrors of Yosemite aren't just missing people, bad weather, and sketchy park politics. Somehow, this place also managed to get tangled up with one of the strangest modern cryptids on the internet, the Fresno Nightcrawlers. those little white walking pairs of pants that look like they escaped from a cursed Pixar short. The basic story starts not in Yosemite itself, but in Fresno in the late 2000s. A man usually referred to only as Jose set up a security camera because his dogs were freaking out at night. One night, the camera caught something bizarre crossing his front lawn. A tall, thin, white figure with almost no torso and 2 long legs, followed by a much smaller one behind it. They move in this floaty puppet-like gait, like they're gliding more than walking. The footage eventually made its way onto TV and then the internet, where people immediately went, okay, that has to be CGI. And other people went, no, that's definitely a new cryptid. A paranormal reality show later recreated the scenes using puppets and a child in a costume and basically concluded they couldn't prove it was a hoax, but they also couldn't prove it was real. Where Yosemite really gets pulled into this is the second sighting. A few years after the original Fresno tape, another piece of security footage surfaced from a place called Yosemite Lakes Park, a residential community in the Sierra foothills, north of Fresno and not far from the broader Yosemite region. In that video, you see what look like 2 similar white walking legs moving across a hillside at night. The quality is bad, the angle is weird, and if you want to believe, it's enough to convince you the night crawlers aren't just a one-off glitch in a single VHS tape. Even though Yosemite Lakes Park isn't inside the official national park boundary, the name Yosemite, the piney hills, and the timing of both clips were enough for the internet to file this thing mentally under things that haunt Yosemite, and I guess me included because I put it in this video. From there, the lore went insane. People started claiming the night crawlers were connected to ancient Native American legends from the region, peaceful, spindly creatures that protect the land, guardians with the long legs so they can walk through marshes, that sort of thing. It sounds cool, and it fits into the vibe people want Yosemite to have. Ancient spirits stalking the fog at tree line while campers go missing down there. The problem is, when folklorists went looking for any actual pre-existing native stories that matched the Fresno nightcrawler specifically, they came up empty. There's no documented Miwok or other local tradition that clearly lines up with tiny walking white pants, which means the ancient legend angle is almost certainly a modern invention layered on after the videos went viral. Skeptically, there are a bunch of obvious explanations. The first Fresno video looks a lot like a marionette or a simple costume rig. A person covered in dark cloth with white, long fabric legs filmed on a low-resolution camera where shadows and depth are hard to read. The Yosemite Lakes Park clip could be the exact same idea scaled up. Thin people or kids walking in baggy white pants, maybe on some kind of stilts or poles, shot at night from far away. Video compression, bad lighting, and the way interlaced video handles movement can all make something ordinary look uncanny. That's why every serious breakdown of the footage ends up saying some version of, "It's probably hoaxable, there's nothing in the physics that screams impossible, and we don't have any extra evidence beyond 2 short, low-quality clips." With how huge and vertical Yosemite is, it kind of makes sense that people start blaming the cliffs on something supernatural. You've got 3,000-foot walls, narrow ledges, wet granite everywhere, and waterfalls that look like they're actively trying to reel you in. Bridal Veil Fall is one of the first big waterfalls you see when you drive into the valley, and it has that perfect horror story setup. A beautiful, thin, white ribbon of water dropping about 600 plus feet off a sheer wall with constant wind throwing mist around so hard it can soak you at the viewpoint. Indigenous people in the area treated that spot as dangerous long before it became a photo op. And that is where the Po-Ho-No story comes in. According to legend, 2 Awa-Nichi women are up near the top of the cliff picking berries. The day is calm, the valley below looks impossibly far away, and there's this faint mist hanging over the top, like the air itself is breathing. One of the women drifts closer to the edge, either to get a better look or reach a cluster of berries that's just out of reach. As she steps into the mist, the wind suddenly snaps awake. It doesn't build gradually, it hits all at once. There's a shriek of air, a blast from the void under the cliff, and she's gone, blown or pulled straight off the edge into the rocks and churning water below. When the survivors make it back to camp, the chief doesn't blame bad footing or accident. He blames Po-ho-no, an evil spirit in the wind that lures people too close to the drop and then takes them. From that point on, he forbids his people from walking near the brink, especially when the mist is blowing. That specific two women picking berries setup is one of several story variants that grew around a deeper belief that a spirit lived in the wind and mist by that waterfall, and it was not friendly. In older sources, you see the name written as Po-ho-no or Pohono, and it shows up as both the name of a haunted lake and as the spirit of the puffing or evil wind that blows down a creek and over the falls. The idea is the same either way though. It's a force that can change in a second, slam into you sideways, and push you exactly where you really shouldn't be standing. In some Miwok or Awa-nichi traditions, people were warned not to linger at the edge and not to stare directly into the fall, because that's when the spirit notices you and something bad happens. Later retellings add that inhaling the mist from a safe distance could bring luck in love or a successful marriage, but looking straight into the waterfall could curse you. So the mist is both tempting and dangerous, which lines up perfectly with the common thread with a lot of legends, like the hypnotic rainbow angle. It's pretty, it pulls you closer, and that's how you get killed. And the evil wind part isn't just dramatic language either. Up on those cliffs, the air really can turn on you. Bridal Veil is famous for gusts that suddenly reverse the flow of water, blowing the entire waterfall sideways or even back up on the wall. Hikers and tourists constantly underestimate how slick the rock is around Yosemite's waterfalls. Wet granite plus sand plus a surprise gust is a brutal combo. Modern park data backs up how bad that can get. Yosemite has hundreds of search and rescue calls every year, and a steady handful of deaths with falls, wet granite, and water hazards showing up again and again in the incident reports. The Po-ho-no legend basically takes that very real risk and personifies it. Instead of saying this is a set of physical conditions that will kill you if you're careless, it says there's a spirit here that wants you close to the edge. And the haunting angle grows naturally out of that. If an evil wind is pushing people off cliffs, then the dead don't just disappear, they hang around. In some versions, the spirits of those who fell are said to linger in the mist, crying out or whispering, helping Po-ho-no draw more victims up to the brink. In other versions, the warning is more subtle. If you feel that weird pull to walk out on a slick rock or climb a little higher for the view, that impulse itself is Po-ho-no nudging you forward. The point for the original storytellers wasn't here's a cute ghost story, it was supposed to be a safety protocol wrapped in myth. Don't wander too close, don't disrespect the place, and don't assume you can outsmart the mountain. If you ignore that, the fall doesn't look like an accident anymore. It looks like the spirit finally got you. Summit Meadow looks harmless at first. It's this quiet open patch off Glacier Point Road, the kind of place where families pull over, let the kids run around, and take pictures of wildflowers before heading back to the car. In the summer of 1983, that's exactly what was happening. Kids playing in the grass while the adults relaxed nearby. Until the kids came back holding something they should never have had in their hands. A human forearm and hand, badly decomposed, tucked just off the edge of the road. Park rangers and investigators descended on Summit Meadow, combing the area around the find. The location was unnerving. Not some remote cliff or backcountry ravine, but a pull-off along a paved road that thousands of tourists drive every year. They searched the woods, the ditches, the meadow itself, looking for a body or any sign of who this person had been. Nothing. No torso, no legs, no clothing, no ID. Just that single single arm and hand, as if someone had dropped a piece of a person in the middle of one of the most visited parks in the country and then just vanished. For years, the case sat in that limbo, an unidentified victim cataloged as a Jane Doe from Summit Meadow. Then, in 1988, hikers in roughly the same area stumbled on more remains, a skull and additional bones, far enough deteriorated that investigators couldn't even be sure how long they'd been out there, but close enough in age and condition that they were eventually believed to belong to the same person as the severed arm. Again, the location was right off a road, not deep in some hidden canyon. Yosemite is huge wilderness, but whoever left her there didn't bother to go very far from the pavement. Because there was no name, the investigation focused on how she might have died and who might have put her there. At one point, authorities looked seriously at Henry Lee Lucas, the drifter who confessed to hundreds of murders across the United States. Lucas claimed that he and an accomplice had picked up a woman hitchhiking in California in the early 1980s, killed her, and dumped her remains in a national park. Some of the details, time frame, rough location, body left in pieces, lined up uncomfortably well with the Summit Meadow discovery, and his confession was treated as a real lead for a while. But Lucas was notorious for false confessions, and investigators never found enough solid evidence tying him to the Yosemite remains. The case stayed technically open, but practically cold. Decades went by. The arm, the hand, and the skull sat in evidence, officially belonging to Summit Meadow Jane Doe. It wasn't until the 2010s, when genetic genealogy started changing how cold cases are handled, that anything actually really moved. Investigators extracted DNA, built a profile, and began matching it against open source genealogical databases. Finally, in 2022, after building out a family tree and contacting relatives, the victim was finally given a name: Patricia Patty Hicks, also known in some records as Patricia Lorraine Hicks or Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom, a woman who had vanished from her life years earlier with no clear explanation of where she'd gone. Putting a name to the bones helped, but it didn't actually close the case. If anything, it made things weirder. Once investigators knew who Patricia was, they could start mapping her life, where she lived, who she spent time with, what kinds of groups she was involved in. That's when they started running into rumors and leads that pointed in two very different, but equally dark, directions. One set of leads suggested she may have crossed paths with a convicted serial killer who moved through California during the same era, someone who died in prison roughly 2 decades before her remains were identified, making it nearly impossible to question him or chase fresh corroboration. Another trail hinted at connections to a fringe religious group or cult-like community whose leader was known for preying on women, but by the time her name was finally known, witnesses had scattered, memories had faded, and nothing could be proven. So you end up with this really unsettling picture. A once anonymous woman, now identified, whose arm and hand were left in a meadow off a family road in Yosemite, a skull discovered years later in the same area, a tangle of possible suspects that includes a notorious false confessing serial killer and a predatory cult leader, and no definitive story of what actually happened between the day Patricia was last seen alive and the moment those kids bent down in the grass and realized they were looking at a human hand. The park moved on, the traffic on Glacier Point Road kept flowing, the meadow went back to being peaceful. But every time you drive past Summit Meadow now, you know that somewhere just beyond the tree line, a woman's body was scattered, and even with a name and modern forensics, nobody can say for sure who took her there or why. Yosemite by Travis Scott isn't a nature song in the literal sense. Nobody's hiking Half Dome or camping under the stars here. Instead, Yosemite is used as a symbol, not a setting. At its core, the song is about extreme abundance and ease. Money, luxury, motion, and status flowing so smoothly that it feels weightless. Gunna's chorus is repetitive on purpose. Jet, ice, checks, designer brands, rinse and repeat. There's no struggle narrative, no tension, just calm flexing. That calm is important. Yosemite National Park is famous for being massive, quiet, and overwhelming without being chaotic. It represents something untouchable and above everyday noise, which mirrors how Travis and Gunna frame their lives here. When Travis talks about hopping off jets, arriving early, being covered with angels and feeling chosen, it lines up with the idea of standing somewhere elevated, physically and socially. Yosemite is literally high ground. Cliffs, peaks, open space. In rap terms, that translates to being far removed from normal life. They're not rushing, they're not stressing, and they're not scrambling. Even time bends around them, like in the quote, "Said I'd be there in 10, but I got there in 4. That's power expressed quietly. The luxury imagery also parallels nature in a subtle way. Their jewelry, quote, "shines like the sun." Their status feels permanent, monumental. And Yosemite is one of those places that feels ancient and immovable. By naming the song after it, they're framing their success as something similarly grand and enduring. Not flashy in a loud way, but imposing just by existing. The laid-back tempo matters too. This isn't a hype anthem, it drifts. That drifting, floaty feeling matches the mental image of looking out over a huge valley or flying above mountains. You're rich enough that life slows down. That's why the song feels more like cruising than celebrating. And also Nav's inclusion on the song really adds to more of that background scenery, floaty, spacious feel. Okay guys, I know this doesn't really fit in the actual video that well, but if I'm doing a video about Yosemite and my favorite rap artist has a song called that, I gotta include it at least a little bit. And yeah, I indulged a little bit with how I wrote that script, but I mean, I couldn't just change the tone completely. Anyway, let's get into some more actual mysteries and horrors of Yosemite. But shout out Trav, shout out Gunna. Actually, I don't know, with all the YSL stuff going on. And shout out Nav for sure. But let's move on. I was digging around for weird Yosemite stories, and I ended up on this little National Park Service blog post from 2023 called Yosemite, the Weird and the Wonderful. It's written by an archives intern, and they mention being told to clean out an old filing cabinet in the Yosemite Museum. Just boring admin stuff, budgets, daily reports, letters. Then they hit a folder labeled the Yosemite Mummy. Inside is a newspaper clipping of an average-sized guy standing next to a mummified woman who's almost 7 feet tall with a small bundled child beside her. The caption called them the Martindale mummies, supposedly discovered in 1855 in a sealed cave somewhere in Yosemite Valley. The clipping claims this giant mother and child pair was found by miners, and that the woman's body was close to 7 feet tall. The blog points out that the Awanichi, the indigenous people whose homeland includes Yosemite Valley, had a legend about giant enemies who once roamed their land. So the obvious question is this giantess supposed to be one of those enemies, or were those miners just screwing with people? The intern basically admits that we don't know. The clipping is just there. No mummy in storage, no catalog record that says, oh yeah, this is where we stuck the 7-foot corpse. Just a random 19th century newspaper photo in a folder with no clean provenance. Once you zoom out, it fits a pattern you see all over 1800s America. Newspapers loved hoaxes about giant skeletons and petrified men because they sold papers. Think the Cardiff Giant or the Calaveras skull. Both fake, ancient remains conveniently found by miners in the middle of gold country hype. California in the 1850s is the same ecosystem. Gold rush chaos, bored miners, and a public obsessed with biblical giants and lost races. Add in real Awanichi stories about dangerous, larger-than-life enemies in the mountains, and you've got the perfect recipe for someone to pose with a staged giant mummy and send the photo to a paper. What makes the Yosemite mummy story creepy isn't that we've secretly got a 7-foot corpse locked in a vault somewhere. There's zero evidence of that. But it is just the kind of, you know, the mental image that the article leaves you with, like lost media almost. A sealed cave high on granite walls, a dried out woman and child tucked away in the dark, and a group of miners prying it open a few years after the US violently pushed the Awanichi out of their valley. Either there really was a body that's been lost to time, or there never was one and the whole thing is just a tall tale built on top of a culture that had already been displaced. Out in the low, dry foothills east of Fresno, on the roads people take toward Yosemite, there's this other legend that sits in the back of locals' minds: the Watts Valley wolf ape. It's not a park brochure monster, it's more like something you hear about at 1 a.m. from someone who's lived out there their whole life and says, "Yeah, my uncle saw it once." The basic description is always the same: long gray mangy hair, an ape or baboon-like face with flat, human-style eyes, and these freaky human-looking hands and feet. People say it moves on all fours like a sick dog, constantly coughing and foaming at the mouth, like it's diseased or poisoned but somehow never dies. Older stories call it the devil ape or devil fang. More recent ones tie it to a specific place, and that's how it picked up the name Watts Valley wolf ape. The history people tell about it stretches all the way back to the first migrations over the Bering Strait. In that version, the creature followed early native groups down into what's now California, living alongside them long enough to show up in old rock art, a hunched, hairy thing with an ape face and those weirdly human hands. That part is folklore, not archaeology. These aren't verified petroglyphs anyone can point to with a museum label, but it's how locals frame it. They say this thing has supposedly been here as long as people have. And then you get the famous witness story, Ansel Adams. One retelling has him camping near Yosemite when a pack of these things came nosing around his tent at night. He supposedly stayed huddled inside, according to legend, listening to something big and quadrupedal circle the canvas, coughing and snorting in the dark until it finally wandered off. There's no paper trail for that in his official biographies, but it's become part of the regional mythology. The idea that the guy who sold America on Yosemite's beauty also had a private encounter with the ugly side of the Sierra. The older valley stories are even more chaotic. There's the one about a one-room schoolhouse somewhere in the southern Central Valley, where a single wolf ape allegedly crashed through the door in the middle of class. The kids shoved their desks into a barricade and scrambled up into the rafters while the teacher locked himself in a closet. The creature didn't go for them, it went for their lunches. It tore desks apart just to get at the food, scarfed everything down, and then left like it had just raided a trash can. Another tale says a preacher in the 1950s shot one, declared it a pet of Satan, and hung the corpse on the church wall until the smell got so bad that he sold it to a traveling circus. He used the money to go start a ministry in San Francisco and was murdered shortly after arriving. His body so mutilated it took months to identify. People in that version whispered that he was cursed for killing the beast. By the 1990s, the wolf ape is still popping up in stories, but it's drifted closer to the mountains. One sighting has it at Base Lake, down on all fours at the shoreline drinking. From a distance, people thought it was just a very hairy man until they realized the gait was all wrong. More like a huge animal with a primate's face than any person. The most detailed modern account comes from the Watts Valley Cemetery. Two guys out hunting for garnets said a 6-foot-long, gray, dog-like thing with a baboon face and human eyes came out of the bushes and chased them across pastures. Cows scattered as it ran. They jumped fences until they finally dove behind the tombstones at the tiny cemetery, only for the thing to track them by scent. According to the story, the uncle threw cinnamon gum at it in a panic. The wolf ape stopped to investigate the smell just long enough for a cemetery caretaker to pull up in a truck and get them out of there. There's no evidence for any of this in police logs or park records, and even locals in Watts Valley have pushed back on the details, pointing out, for example, that the cemetery never had a caretaker living on site, and that the stones really aren't that big enough to hide behind. But that's kind of how these foothill stories work. You've got this stretch of land between Fresno and Yosemite that's empty enough to feel wild, but close enough to civilization that legends spread fast. And I mean, it's one of my videos on my channel, so I have to include some Reddit stories, of course. I found this thread from Unlikely Ad 9744 on Reddit, where OP asks, "Tips and scary stories? I'm gonna be working at a lodge this upcoming February and will be in the park for 4 months. My first time doing this seasonal job. Was wondering if you had any tips for the area, like places to avoid and to visit, scary stories, cool experiences, or hikes. Now I'm going to read some of the responses to this. First, a short one from Forward Study 7812. My friends and I were followed being the last people off Cloud's Rest one year. I think the only thing that ended up saving us was an unexpected other hiker, a guy, came down the trail when we were 45 minutes in the dark and spooked the two creepy guys. My friend never hikes without her gun on federal land anymore. That's scary, like actual creepy men chasing you. I feel bad for women, dude. And weak men like me sometimes. And most people, you know? God, bro, creepy men ruin it for all of us. Anyway, the next one is coming from Classic Chef 4789. I recently started working for a carpentry business. I'm fresh out of high school, so I'm pretty much brand new to this type of work. One early morning, my boss had called me and told me to make my way over to one of the job sites we were at. Once I got there, he directed me on what to do, and he was on his way. I was the only one at this specific house due to us being understaffed, 6 of us. Once he left, I took off my shoes and walked down to the steps when I heard what sounded like panting in the basement. I figured the family just had a pet somewhere down there, so I continued walking down the stairs. I got into the room that was unfinished and had all our equipment and began cleaning buckets for mud when I heard a bark, but not just an ordinary bark. It sounded like a grown man imitating a bark, so I instantly assumed it was my boss who forgot something and was trying to scare me. I dropped my stuff and walked to the door and yelled his name to see if he was there. No reply. I was kinda getting a little creeped out, so I decided to leave the room I was in to make my way upstairs. But before I could, I heard that barking noise again coming from somewhere down in the basement. I went and checked one of the rooms down there, and when I saw the source of the noise, I got so scared. The way the eyes looked made me feel so uneasy. It was so uncanny the way the dog looked. It was a very large dog. Almost like a grown man was hiding inside of a dog's skin. My eyes started watering up and I had chills everywhere. My blood still runs cold just thinking about it. These next few come from another post in r/Yosemite from 22 Nightmare titled "People Who Saw Strange Things in Yosemite, What Happened and What Was That?" First, I'm gonna read from a deleted user. We were on our 3rd or 4th day backpacking through Tulum. Both of us bathed in a river and decided we should have some fun time. We hiked probably 15 miles that day and did not see anyone. No one. Weird for Yosemite. When my now wife and I started engaging in our love ritual, almost immediately an old Asian man appeared literally out of nowhere. He did not have a backpack, just walking, chilling, and smiling. While we are both atheists, we continue to say that had to be God randomly appearing. That's crazy, and I would be so scared and shocked. Next one comes from the Barroom Hero. My first trip, we were hiking up to the mist trail with the crowd in the morning. Someone started taking pictures of something on the hill on the left side of the path, not the side with the view, so naturally everyone passing stopped and started looking. Just above the path was a baby bear, just vibing, walking around. Super cute. It eventually started walking back up the hill, and that's when the weird thing happened. 2 boys, probably around 10 to 11 years old, just started walking up the hill after the bear, off the path into the damn bush. No parent yelling after them, no one with them. Not even a parent standing around that spot on the path, frantically asking if anyone saw where their kids went. No idea what became of this, but hopefully the mama bear took them in as one of their own and now they live as bears. Best possible outcome. I hope those kids are safe. Sorry, Redditor. Next one comes from Mildly Skeptical 22. We were slowly driving past El Capitan on the way out and saw a big bobcat crossing the road about 20 feet in front of us. I stopped the car and started taking pictures with a digital camera. I slowly pulled up next to the path it was walking on and continued to take several more photos through the rolled down passenger window. The bobcat eventually disappeared into the woods. When we got home, the cat wasn't in any of the photos. The one through the windshield or the side window had the road and the path and the trees, but no bobcat. I was watching the cat through the lens of the camera as I took each shot, but it wasn't in any of them. We call it the ghost bobcat of El Capitan. Next is one from TS Southwest. In the heavy forest between Hogdon Meadows and Crane Flat, I saw a rotund creature. In 2010, I took a group to the valley. After spending a few days hiking Half Dome, the days before the insane lottery were awesome, in Yosemite Falls, we went back to our camp at Hogdon Meadows. We fell asleep pretty. The final day, we decided to explore the dark nearby forest. After a few moments of hiking, we started to hear a strange noise, a mix between growling and talking, only to then see a large, hairy white, portly thing rise up on 2 feet, shout, and stumble into the forest. It was very odd. We found out later a 55-year-old Serbian tourist got blackout drunk the night before, and the creature was actually just a hungover naked man named Alexander. Credit/source if used, please. So you're welcome. All right, guys, and with that, I think it's finally time to finish up this Horrors of Yosemite National Park video. This is a big, long video. I hope you enjoyed. More videos like this to come for sure, but have a great night, everyone. Thank you for sticking around so long. Sleep well, everyone, and sweet dreams.